The grand ballroom shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers, guests mingling in their finest attire, the clinking of glasses filling the air. The rich aroma of gourmet food drifted through the room as laughter and conversation echoed. But amidst the luxury, there stood a stark contrast. At the back of the room, dressed in a simple, modest dress, stood a young black maid, nervously clutching a bouquet of flowers. Her dress was a stark contrast to the shimmering gowns around her, her shoes worn, her hair neatly styled but plain. She looked out of place, as though the glittering world around her was something she could never be a part of. The guests at the wedding, some sipping champagne, others engaged in animated conversations, cast curious glances at her, whispering among themselves. A hushed laugh escaped from one of the guests as they eyed the maid with judgment. "What is she doing here?" they sneered. She couldn't be a part of this world. The wedding was the event of the season, a display of wealth, status, and luxury, and yet here was a maid who seemed as out of place as a drop of rain in the desert. But no one knew what she was about to do. As the ceremony began, the atmosphere grew tense with excitement. The groom, a man dressed in a sharp tuxedo, stood at the altar, his face a mix of nervous anticipation and joy. But it was not the groom who commanded attention. All eyes turned toward the door as the young maid slowly walked down the aisle. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was something else, a quiet determination. The murmurs grew louder as the guests began to realize that this was no ordinary wedding. This was no simple maid. She was about to marry the man everyone thought was beneath her, the man whose reputation had been tarnished by his humble beginnings. Guests exchanged confused glances, some even snickering under their breath. How could a maid, someone so low in society, marry a man with such a prestigious reputation? The groom's background had always been a mystery to many. People assumed he was a simple man, maybe even a self-made millionaire, but no one knew the full truth. The guests began to laugh quietly among themselves, their whispers sharp with mockery, but the maid ignored them. She kept her eyes focused on the man standing at the altar. As she reached him, the groom reached out, taking her hand, and a hush fell over the room. The air seemed to freeze for a moment. The guests leaned in, wondering how this bizarre pairing could be happening. They watched as the groom smiled softly at the maid, his eyes gleaming with a secret. The maid looked up at him, unsure of what would come next. The laughter died down. What happened next was something no one could have predicted. The groom cleared his throat and turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "there is something you do not know about me." The guests fell silent, curiosity hanging in the air. He paused, then looked directly at the maid, his gaze filled with emotion. "This woman, this maid, is not who you think she is. And neither am I." The shock in the room was palpable. No one had expected this. The laughter that had once filled the room now turned into stunned silence, and all eyes were now focused on the groom, waiting for the truth to unfold. The room was filled with an eerie silence as the groom's words hung in the air. Guests exchanged confused glances, unsure of how to process what had just been said. The laughter that had once echoed through the ballroom had completely faded, replaced by a tense stillness. The maid, her heart racing, stood there with her hand still in the groom's, uncertain of what was about to happen. The groom turned to face the guests, his demeanor calm, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed the weight of the moment. "I know many of you are confused right now," he continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet power. "You've all been wondering who this woman is and why she's here. But you don't know her the way I do." He paused, letting his words sink in. The guests shifted in their seats, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for him to reveal what he meant. "You see," he went on, "this woman, this maid, she is not just a servant. She is a part of something much bigger. Something that none of you could have ever expected." The room was now completely still, every person on edge, trying to make sense of the situation. The groom's words had taken an unexpected turn, and no one knew how to respond. The maid, though still nervous, stood straighter, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She felt a strange sense of comfort in his words, but at the same time, fear lingered in her heart. She had no idea where this was going, but she had no choice but to trust him. "I know you've all been wondering about me too," the groom said, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of several guests. "Who I am, what I've done, and why I've chosen to marry a woman from such a different world." He took a deep breath, his voice lowering as he prepared to reveal the truth. "The truth is," he began, "I am not who I've let you believe I am. I'm not just a wealthy man who built his empire from nothing." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the guests processed the words. They had always believed that the groom was a self-made millionaire, a man who had worked hard to achieve success. But now, with his confession, they were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about him. "I am not the man you think I am," he repeated, his voice growing more intense. "In fact, my wealth, my name, my reputation, everything I built, has been a lie." The room was now filled with gasps of disbelief. The guests were no longer sure whether they were witnessing a confession or some kind of performance. The groom's words were unsettling, leaving everyone wondering what he was hiding. The maid, still holding his hand, looked up at him with wide eyes, her mind racing. What was he talking about? Was he really who he claimed to be? "I know this is hard to believe," the groom continued, "but I was not always this man. I wasn't always the successful businessman you all see before you." He turned back to the maid, his expression softening. "And this woman, she's not just a maid. She's been with me through it all, even before I had anything." The guests looked on in stunned silence as the groom's words began to sink in. The maid had been there with him all along? How was that possible? "I owe her everything," the groom said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's the one who helped me find my way when I had nothing, when I was just a homeless man on the streets." A gasp echoed through the room. The guests exchanged shocked glances, struggling to comprehend the weight of his words. The groom, now speaking with a mixture of pride and sadness, continued, "I was lost. I had nothing to my name, no direction, no purpose. But this woman, she came into my life when I needed her most. She helped me when no one else would, when I was at my lowest point." The maid's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and pride. She had never expected to be the center of attention, especially not in front of all these people. But as the groom spoke, something inside her stirred. She had known all along that there was more to his story than anyone realized. She had seen the man behind the success, the person who had struggled, who had fought to get where he was. "You may think that she's beneath you," the groom continued, his voice rising with intensity. "But you don't know her story. You don't know what she's been through. You don't know the strength she has." The guests were silent now, some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The groom's words had struck a chord with them, and many began to wonder if they had misjudged both him and the woman standing beside him. "This woman," the groom said, "is my equal. She's my partner, my friend, and my love. And no matter what you all think, she's the one who made me who I am today." The guests were no longer laughing. The room had shifted. What had started as mockery had slowly turned into respect. As the groom finished his story, the maid stood beside him, no longer the nervous, out-of-place figure she had been when she walked down the aisle. She was now standing tall, her head held high, proud of the man beside her and proud of her own journey. The truth had been revealed, and with it, everything had changed. Inevitably, the tension in the room began to shift, though no one knew exactly where it was heading. The guests, who had been so quick to laugh and judge, now sat frozen in place, each trying to piece together the truth the groom had just revealed. There was a quiet hum in the air, as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath. The maid, her hand still gently clasped in his, stood at the altar, staring up at the man who had just turned their lives upside down. She had always known that the world was full of surprises, but this? This was a shock even to her. What had he meant by all of this? She had never thought of herself as anything other than a maid, nothing more than a simple worker in a world of the rich and powerful. She had accepted that role without question, living her life humbly, not expecting anything more than what life had handed her. But now, as she stood there, facing the man who had once been nothing more than a stranger on the streets, everything had changed. The maid's mind raced, trying to catch up with the revelations. The groom, who had shared his story, who had revealed his deepest secrets, had somehow found a way to make her feel as though she was more than what she had always been. His words echoed in her ears. She was his equal, his partner, his love. He had built an empire with her by his side, though none of the guests had known. They had never seen her as anything more than an invisible presence. She was just the maid. The one who cleaned the floors and served the drinks. But now, she had a name. She had a face. And most importantly, she had a place beside him. She glanced up at the groom, who still held her hand. His expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes, a sense of purpose that had not been there before. It was as if, for the first time, he was standing tall in front of the people who had once mocked him. And now, they were starting to see him for who he truly was, not just the wealthy businessman, but a man with a story that had not been told until now. Slowly, the guests began to shift in their seats, their minds struggling to understand the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The groom was not who they thought he was. And neither was the maid. They had been living in a world that was not real. The facade had been shattered, and the truth was starting to seep through the cracks. One of the guests, an older woman with a harsh demeanor, finally broke the silence. But, what about the money? The fame? The luxury? She asked, her voice trembling. The groom looked at her, his expression softening as he spoke. What about it? He said quietly. What is money, if you don't have anyone to share it with? What is fame, if you don't have someone to stand beside you when the world turns its back? The maid felt a warmth spread through her chest as the groom's words resonated deep within her. She had never thought of herself as worthy of wealth or status. She had always assumed that her place was to serve, to be a silent figure in the background of the lives of the rich and powerful. But now, standing here beside the man who had once been homeless, she began to understand something new. The value of a person is not determined by their wealth or their background. It is defined by the choices they make, by the love they give, and by the integrity they uphold. The groom turned back to face the guests. This woman, he said, has taught me more than any amount of money or power ever could. She taught me that true strength comes from within. That kindness, loyalty, and love are the real treasures in this world. The guests, still stunned by the revelation, sat in silence. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing that they had underestimated both the groom and the maid. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, and there was a sense of unease. They had laughed, they had mocked, and now they were faced with the reality that they had been wrong. Slowly, the groom stepped forward, still holding the maid's hand. I don't need your approval, he said, his voice calm but firm. What I need is for you to understand that we are all the same. No one is above anyone else. We all have a story, a journey that has brought us to where we are. And that journey is what makes us who we are. The room was silent once again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was a silence filled with understanding, with respect. The guests had come to realize that there was more to this story than they had ever imagined. They had seen the groom as nothing more than a symbol of wealth, a man who had everything. But now, they were beginning to understand that his true wealth lay in something far more valuable, his heart, his resilience, and his love for the woman who had been by his side through it all. The maid looked up at the groom, her heart swelling with pride. She had never imagined that this moment would come, but now that it had, she knew that their story was far from over. Together, they had overcome the odds, and together, they would face whatever came next. As the evening wore on, the guests began to leave the ballroom one by one, their once loud voices now replaced by a silence that lingered in the air. The groom and the maid stood in the center of the room, their hands still intertwined, the weight of the truth settling around them. The once glamorous celebration had turned into something deeper, something more meaningful. The maid looked around the room, her gaze drifting over the empty chairs and tables that had once been filled with the noise of laughter and clinking glasses. The grand chandelier overhead still shimmered, but now, it felt different. It was as though the light had changed, no longer just a symbol of wealth and luxury, but a reminder of the journey they had both traveled to get to this point. She looked up at the groom, who stood beside her, his eyes reflecting the same quiet determination she felt in her heart. The room that had once been full of judgment now felt like a sanctuary, a place where the past had been shed and the future was waiting to be written. The guests were gone, but the truth had been spoken. It was no longer just a wedding, a union between two people, it was a testament to the power of overcoming the odds, to the strength of love and loyalty. The maid had never imagined that she would find herself in such a place. Growing up, she had always known her place, always the helper, always in the background. But now, here she stood, not as a servant, but as a partner, standing beside a man who had once been just as lost as she had felt. She had never expected this life, never dreamed of such a moment. But now that it was here, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had both fought to get to this point. It had not been an easy road, but they had walked it together, and now they stood on the other side, ready to face whatever came next. The groom, sensing her thoughts, gave her hand a gentle squeeze. He turned to face her, his expression soft, but filled with a quiet strength. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, his voice low. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought this day would come," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now that it's here, it feels like it was meant to be." The groom smiled, a look of understanding passing between them. "It was always meant to be," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We just had to trust that the journey would lead us here." He paused, then added, "And now that we're here, we can make the future our own." The maid's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at him. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone with so much power and wealth, would ever see her as an equal. But here they were, standing side by side, not just as partners, but as equals. For the first time in her life, she truly felt seen. They had both been through so much. He had come from nothing, and she had always been told that she would never be more than a servant. But together, they had proven that no label could define them. No amount of wealth or status could change who they were at their core. As the night continued, the two of them walked hand in hand through the grand ballroom, the guests long gone, leaving behind only the echoes of their laughter and whispers. The groom led the maid to the window, where they looked out at the city skyline. The lights of the city stretched out before them, a symbol of all the possibilities that lay ahead. The maid stood there, her hand resting in his, and for the first time, she allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of a future where they could build something together, where they could create a life that was not defined by the past or by the opinions of others. "We can do anything," she said softly, her voice filled with hope. "Together, we can do anything." The groom turned to her, his eyes filled with affection. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "together, we can do anything." And in that moment, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it as partners, as equals, as a team. They had come from different worlds, but together, they had created something that no one could ever take away. Their journey was just beginning, and they were ready to face whatever the future held. As the days passed, the world around the maid and the groom began to change, though it was clear that they were both still adjusting to their newfound reality. The wedding had been a turning point, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed the truth unfold. The guests, who had once laughed and mocked them, now saw them in a completely different light. The groom's revelation had shaken their world, but it had also opened their eyes to the possibilities of what could be. The maid, once a simple worker in the background, now stood beside the groom as an equal, not just in name, but in their hearts and minds. Yet, despite the newfound respect they had gained, they both knew that their journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, obstacles to overcome, and questions to answer. The world was watching them now, and the road ahead would not be easy. As the weeks passed, they found themselves spending more time together, not just as a couple, but as partners in the truest sense of the word. They worked together to build a life that was uniquely their own, one that wasn't defined by wealth, status, or the expectations of others. The maid, whose name was now known to all, found herself slowly shedding the old labels that had been placed on her for so long. She no longer felt like an outsider, no longer just a maid. She had a voice, a purpose, and a future that she was excited to embrace. But with this new life came new challenges. The world was not always kind to those who dared to break free from society's expectations. The couple faced criticism, whispers behind their backs, and even outright hostility from those who couldn't understand their bond. Some saw the groom as weak for marrying a woman who had once been nothing more than a maid. Others judged the maid for daring to stand beside someone they considered above her. But neither of them let these whispers reach their hearts. They knew that their love and partnership were stronger than anything anyone could say. They faced their challenges head-on, and with every passing day, they grew stronger together. The groom, once a man of mystery and hidden truths, was now fully open, and he stood by the maid, showing the world what it truly meant to love and respect another person. For the first time, he wasn't hiding in the shadows of his past. He had embraced it, and so had she. Together, they were no longer defined by their pasts, but by the future they were building. The maid had always dreamed of a life where she could make a difference, where she could be seen for who she truly was. Now, standing beside the man who had once been her savior, she was finally getting the chance to live that dream. She was no longer just an accessory to his life, she was his equal, his partner, his love. The world may have expected them to fail, but they had proven that love, respect, and determination were stronger than any obstacle. Their life together was not about wealth, not about status, not about anything that could be measured in material terms. It was about the deep connection they shared, the trust they had built, and the unbreakable bond they had formed. As they stood side by side, looking out at the horizon, they both knew that they had already achieved something greater than any of the riches the world had to offer. They had found something priceless, a love that transcended all boundaries, a partnership that would withstand the tests of time. And as they took the first steps into this new chapter of their lives, they did so with the knowledge that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. The maid had come a long way from the woman who once quietly served in the background, and the groom had shed the mask of mystery and vulnerability. Together, they were ready to take on the world and build a future that was truly their own. And no one, not a single soul, could take that away from them. Inevitably, their lives continued to unfold, but not without challenges. As the weeks turned into months, the world around the maid and the groom began to adapt to the new dynamic they had introduced. At first, there were whispers in the streets, rumors that followed them everywhere they went. The couple had become a symbol of defiance against the status quo, but with it came the weight of judgment. Some people looked at them with awe, seeing their story as one of hope, while others couldn't quite understand the union. The maid, once just a figure in the background, now had a voice. She had become something of a symbol herself. Her face was no longer just that of a servant but of a woman who had fought for her place in the world. The groom, once a man shrouded in mystery, now stood proudly beside her, no longer hiding his past but embracing it. Their love was no longer a secret, and neither was the strength they shared. Still, the journey was not without its bumps. As the couple walked through life together, they encountered obstacles that tested their bond. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of public opinion threatened to pull them apart. People who had once accepted the groom's wealth and success now questioned his choice of a partner. They whispered about how she didn't belong in his world, how her past as a maid would always define her. Yet, the couple remained steadfast. They knew that their love was not something that could be broken by judgment or gossip. They had built a foundation strong enough to withstand the world's harshest criticisms. Slowly, but surely, the world began to change around them. The couple didn't need to defend their love, it became obvious to everyone who saw them that it was genuine, that it was real. Those who had once looked down on them started to take notice. Some came to admire the strength they had shown, while others were forced to confront their own biases. The maid had never imagined that her life would turn out this way. She had never dreamed of being a part of the world the groom lived in, a world filled with wealth and influence. But now, standing beside him, she realized that she had always belonged. It wasn't the money or the status that made her worthy, it was her heart, her resilience, and her willingness to stand beside him through thick and thin. It was a truth that they both had come to understand, that love doesn't come from wealth or position. It comes from the connection between two people, the understanding and trust that they build together. One evening, as they sat in the garden of their home, the groom turned to the maid, his expression softening. "We've come so far, haven't we?" he said quietly. The maid smiled, her heart full. "Yes, we have," she agreed. "I never thought I'd be here, but I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." The groom reached out and gently took her hand. "I never thought I'd find someone who could see me for who I truly am," he said. "But you've always seen me. And I see you." The maid's heart swelled at his words. She had always feared that her past would define her, that she would never be seen as more than what she had been. But here, with him, she had become something more. She had become a partner, an equal. And she had earned it through her strength, her heart, and her unwavering belief in their love. Together, the groom continued, we've built something that no one can ever take from us. A future that's ours. She nodded, feeling the truth of his words deep in her chest. They had made it through the toughest of times, and now they were standing on the other side, stronger than ever. The world may have tried to tear them apart, but it had only brought them closer together. And now, with the future stretched out before them, they knew that there was nothing they couldn't face. They had each other. And that was all they would ever need. Inevitably, with their love now out in the open, the challenges continued to test the strength of the bond between the maid and the groom. Though their relationship had gained acceptance in many circles, there were still those who couldn't come to terms with it. The whispers from the past, the judgments that had once stung, still echoed in the halls of society. There were those who couldn't let go of the old narrative that the groom was foolish for marrying a woman who had once served him. They said he was weak, that his love for her was a form of rebellion, but not a love that could endure in the harsh light of reality. And then there were those who, though they admired the couple's strength, found themselves questioning whether such a union could ever truly work. These were the doubts they would face moving forward, but they were also the ones they would challenge head-on. The maid and the groom knew that their love wasn't just about overcoming the judgment of others, it was about standing firm in their own truth, their own connection. They had always known the weight of expectations, but now, together, they would show the world that love, real love, had nothing to do with wealth or status. It was about the heart, the shared experiences, the respect, and the understanding between two people who had seen each other at their worst and still chose to stand by each other. One evening, as they sat together at their kitchen table, the weight of the world outside pressing in, the maid spoke softly, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Do you ever wonder if they're right?" she asked, her eyes searching his. The groom looked at her, his expression unreadable at first. But then, as the weight of her question sank in, he reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. "I don't care what they think," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "I care about us." His words, simple but filled with sincerity, seemed to settle the uncertainty that had been lingering in the room. He was right, of course. They had already proven that they were stronger than the judgments of others. But still, the doubts persisted, creeping into their minds when the world seemed to weigh too heavily on their shoulders. "But it's hard sometimes," she admitted, squeezing his hand gently. "I know they're wrong, but it still hurts." The groom nodded, his gaze softening. "I know it does. But we can't let their opinions define us. They will never understand what we have. And that's okay." The maid smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always known the pain of being underestimated, of being seen as less than, but now, with him, she felt seen in a way she had never imagined. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be obstacles, moments of doubt, and challenges they would have to face. But they also knew that as long as they stood together, nothing could tear them apart. They had already proven that. And so, they moved forward, hand in hand, with the knowledge that they had each other, and that was all they needed to face whatever came next. One afternoon, the maid received a letter from an old acquaintance, someone from her past who had once been a close friend. The letter contained words that shook her to the core. It was an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment conference, a chance to share her story with the world. The invitation felt surreal, almost as if it belonged to someone else. She had never imagined herself as a speaker, let alone someone whose story could inspire others. But as she read the words again, she realized something. This was not just an opportunity, it was a recognition of everything she had worked for, everything she had overcome. It was a chance to show the world that she was more than just a maid, more than just the woman beside the groom. She was a force in her own right. She looked at the groom, who had been watching her silently from across the room. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. The groom smiled, his eyes warm. "I think you've earned this moment," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You are so much more than anyone ever gave you credit for. You've always been strong, and now the world will see that." She smiled, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. It was time for the world to see her, to see what she was capable of, and to recognize the strength she had carried with her all along. With the groom's unwavering support, the maid made the decision to accept the invitation. It was a turning point, a chance to step into the light and show the world that she, too, had something to offer. And so, as the days passed, they both prepared for the next chapter in their journey, one that would take them to new heights, challenge them in ways they had never imagined, and ultimately lead them to a place where they could both shine. They knew the road would be difficult, but they also knew that together there was nothing they couldn't face. Inevitably, with the acceptance of her invitation to the Women's Empowerment Conference, the maid, whose name was now well known in circles far beyond the household she once worked in, stepped into a new chapter of her life. The groom, beside her every step of the way, had seen her evolve from a quiet worker in the background to a powerful woman, ready to share her story with the world. It wasn't just about the title she now held, or the new opportunities opening before her, it was about the transformation that had taken place within her. She had discovered strength she didn't know she had, a confidence that had been buried beneath years of doubt and society's judgments. Now, the time had come to stand in front of others and speak her truth. The days leading up to the conference were filled with nervous anticipation. The maid spent hours preparing, crafting her speech with care. She had never considered herself a speaker, never imagined standing in front of a crowd, but as she worked, she realized that her story was worth telling. It wasn't just a story of struggle, it was a story of resilience, of overcoming the odds, of learning to believe in herself when the world had told her she wasn't enough. The night before the conference, as she and the groom sat together in their quiet home, the weight of the moment was heavy in the air. "I'm scared," she admitted, looking down at the pages of her speech. "I don't know if I can do this." The groom, always her rock, smiled softly and reached for her hand. "You've already done it," he said, his voice steady. "Every step you've taken has brought you to this point. You're ready." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. In his eyes, she saw nothing but pride. "You've always been strong," he continued. "Now, the world is going to see that." The maid's heart swelled with emotion. She had always relied on his support, but tonight, she felt something different. She felt ready. The next morning, they arrived at the conference hall, the venue buzzing with energy. The maid stood at the entrance, feeling the weight of the audience beyond the doors. Her palms were sweaty, her breath shallow. She had prepared, but the reality of the moment was something else entirely. But then, she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. The groom stood behind her, offering her silent support. Without a word, he gave her a reassuring smile, and in that moment, the fear that had gripped her seemed to melt away. "You've got this," he whispered. With a deep breath, the maid walked into the room. As she stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, waiting to see what she would say. But she didn't let it overwhelm her. Instead, she focused on the words she had written, on the story she had spent so long preparing to share. "I used to believe that I was nothing," she began, her voice calm but strong. "I believed that because of my past, I had no future. I was the maid, the servant, the one who cleaned the floors and served the meals. I was invisible. And for a long time, I believed that was all I could ever be." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. The audience was listening now, hanging on every word. "But then, I met someone who saw me, not for my past, not for the work I did, but for who I truly am. And through that love, I found my strength. I found the courage to step into a life I never thought I deserved. And now, here I am, standing before you, sharing my story." There was a pause, a moment of stillness in the room. The maid felt her heart racing, but she didn't falter. She continued, "I am more than what I was told I was. We are all more than what society tells us we can be. We are more than our past. And we have the power to change our futures, to define who we are, regardless of what anyone else thinks." The audience was silent, the room thick with the weight of her words. For a brief moment, the maid felt as though time had stopped. But then, the applause started. It was slow at first, hesitant, but as she continued to speak, it grew louder, stronger. By the time she finished, the entire room was on its feet, applauding her courage, her strength, and her words. When the applause finally died down, the maid stepped down from the stage, her heart full. The groom was waiting for her, his smile wide, his pride evident in his eyes. "You did it," he said softly. "You showed them who you are." She smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I showed myself, too," she whispered. And as they left the conference hall, hand in hand, the maid realized that this was just the beginning. She had taken her first step into the world, not as the maid she had once been, but as the woman she had always been meant to be. And with the groom by her side, she knew that together, they could face anything. Together, they would build a future, not defined by their past, but by the strength they had found in each other. Inevitably, the maid's speech at the conference had made waves, and with the applause still ringing in her ears, she couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they hadn't anticipated. She had always known that her journey would be difficult, but standing there, receiving the admiration of hundreds of people, made it all feel so real, so possible. She felt the weight of her newfound visibility, but also the responsibility that came with it. The groom, standing by her side, saw the quiet shift in her demeanor. He could tell she was still processing the enormity of what had just happened, but he also saw something else, a sense of pride in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Their shared journey had always been about overcoming obstacles together, but now, the world was watching them. The maid had crossed a threshold. She wasn't just the partner of a wealthy man, she had found her own voice, and that voice had resonated with so many people. As they left the conference hall, the admiration and respect they had earned felt like an overwhelming but welcome wave. The crowd's reactions, the heartfelt thank yous from other women who had been inspired by her, all signaled the beginning of something more. The groom gently squeezed her hand, offering her a quiet, reassuring smile. "You were amazing," he whispered. She looked up at him, feeling the weight of the moment. "I can't believe it. I never thought I would be here." He nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "I've always known you were meant for something great." But as they walked out into the cool evening air, there was something else on the horizon. Despite all the progress they had made, despite the admiration they had garnered, the world was still filled with doubt, and some people would never fully accept their union. It was inescapable, the whispers, the judgment. Some had already started to question how long their love could truly last. They said things like, "It's just a phase," or "They're bound to fall apart." The groom had heard the comments, and though he tried to ignore them, he couldn't shake the fear that had begun to settle in. They had overcome so much to get where they were, but the fear of losing it all was always lurking in the back of his mind. It wasn't just about their love anymore, it was about the expectations they had set for themselves. The maid, who had become more aware of the public's perception of their relationship, started to feel the weight of it too. She had grown up knowing what it was like to be underestimated, but now, being in the spotlight, she wasn't sure if she could handle the constant scrutiny. Still, despite these fears, they pressed forward. They had come so far, and they weren't going to let anyone tear them down now. But as time passed, the doubts crept in, even in their strongest moments. One evening, the groom came home early from a meeting. As he walked into the living room, he found the maid sitting on the couch, her head buried in her hands. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in her thoughts. When she looked up, her face was tired, and there was a distant sadness in her eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, his concern evident in his voice. She gave a small, shaky laugh, though it didn't reach her eyes. I just feel like everything is slipping through my fingers," she said. "We've come so far, but it feels like the world is waiting for us to fail." The groom sat down beside her, his hand immediately finding hers. "I know how it feels. The weight of everyone's expectations, it's heavy. But we can't let it break us. Not now." He paused, his words soft but firm. "We've built something stronger than anything anyone can throw at us. You have to believe that." She looked at him, the sadness still there, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. He was right. They had built this together, and they had fought too hard to let it fall apart. "I do believe it," she whispered, squeezing his hand back. "But it's hard. It feels like we're always being watched, always being judged." He nodded, understanding. "The world will always have something to say. But we know the truth. We know what we've been through and what we've built together. And no one can take that from us. The maid looked down at their hands, intertwined, and then back up at him. For the first time in a while, she felt a sense of peace settle within her. They had been through so much, and they had come out stronger on the other side. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "We're ready." With that, they stood up, facing the future together. The road ahead would still have its challenges, and there would be moments of doubt, but they had each other. And as long as they had that, they knew they could face whatever came next. The world could judge them, they could whisper in doubt, but nothing would change the bond they shared. It was stronger than any criticism, any obstacle. Together, they would face whatever came their way. Inevitably, the weeks following the conference were a whirlwind of emotions, both uplifting and challenging. The maid and the groom had learned to navigate the ups and downs of public life, but the journey was far from easy. While they had gained support from many, there were still those who could not accept their relationship. The whispers never fully stopped. Some called it a fleeting romance, others claimed it was only a matter of time before the differences in their backgrounds tore them apart. Yet, with every passing day, the couple proved them wrong. They faced the pressure with quiet strength, each moment of doubt only reinforcing the depth of their commitment to each other. The maid had become more than just the groom's partner, she had become an inspiration to many. Her story of overcoming adversity and embracing her worth had struck a chord with people everywhere. She had spoken at the conference, but she had also become a voice for those who had been overlooked, those who had been told they could never rise above their circumstances. The groom, on the other hand, had become a symbol of courage. His decision to stand by her, to love her without shame, was a testament to his strength. It wasn't just about rejecting societal norms, it was about choosing love, choosing the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing. Together, they had rewritten the story of their lives, and they were doing it on their terms. One quiet evening, as they sat in their home, the maid turned to the groom, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Every day," he said. "I think about how far we've come and how much more we have to do. But I also think about how we'll get through it together." She smiled, feeling the weight of his words. They had faced so many trials, but each time, they had come through stronger. The world was still watching, still judging, but they were no longer worried about it. They had built something real, something that could withstand anything. But as much as they had learned to ignore the noise from outside, they also knew that there were things they still had to face. There were still questions they hadn't answered, aspects of their lives that others were too quick to judge without understanding. The maid's past as a servant, the groom's mysterious rise to wealth, the reasons behind their union, people still wanted to know more, still wanted to scrutinize every detail. And so, one evening, after another round of public scrutiny, they decided to face it head-on. The groom arranged a meeting with the press, inviting journalists to hear their story, to hear it from them, not through the lens of gossip and speculation. When the day came, the couple entered the room together, hand in hand, their posture strong. The journalists, seated around them, fell silent as they waited for the first words to be spoken. The maid took a deep breath, then looked around at the people in the room. "I know there are questions," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Questions about our love, our relationship, and our pasts. And we're here to answer them." The room was still. Every eye was fixed on her as she continued, "We've both been through a lot in our lives, and we've had to fight for everything we have. But the one thing we've never had to fight for is each other. Our love is real, and it's strong, and it's not defined by where we come from, but by who we are." The groom nodded, his voice adding to hers. "I love her for who she is, not for her past, not for what people think she is. And she loves me for the same reason. We're not perfect. We've had our struggles. But we've always been there for each other." The journalists listened, their pens paused in midair. This was not the narrative they had expected. It was not the sensational story they had hoped to write. What they saw before them was a couple that refused to conform to the label society wanted to place on them. The maid and the groom weren't just a fairy tale or a symbol of defiance, they were two people who had found something real, something worth fighting for. We've faced judgment, the maid continued, and will continue to face it. But we're not here to answer to anyone but ourselves. Our future is ours to create, and no one can take that away from us. She paused, her gaze meeting the groom's. Together, we will continue to write our story, and no matter how many people question us, we know we're on the right path. The room was silent for a long moment, but when the first question came, it was not one of skepticism. It was a question of admiration, a recognition of the strength they had shown. The rest of the interview followed, not as an interrogation, but as an opportunity for them to share their truth. They spoke about their journey, their challenges, their love, and how they had come to understand that their relationship was not about public opinion, it was about them, about the bond they had formed and the life they were building together. By the end of the interview, something had changed in the room. The journalists, who had once come ready to uncover a scandal or expose a weakness, now saw a different story unfold, a story of love, resilience, and the power of choice. The maid and the groom had faced the world's questions, and they had answered them with honesty and grace. As they left the press conference, hand in hand, they knew that their journey was far from over. But they had already proven that nothing, not even the judgment of the world, could tear them apart. They were stronger than ever, and together, they would continue to face whatever came next, knowing that they had each other, and that was all they needed. Inevitably, as the weeks passed, the maid and the groom found themselves at a crossroads. The press conference had been a success, but the road ahead was far from smooth. The couple had become symbols of defiance, of breaking through the barriers that society had set for them. However, with this newfound fame came new challenges. As much as the world admired them for their courage, there were still those who couldn't accept their relationship. The whispers in their circles, the subtle glances from strangers, were constant reminders that no matter how much they achieved, they would always be seen as different. The maid, who had grown so much in her confidence, now found herself caught between two worlds. On one hand, she had achieved more than she ever dreamed of. She was no longer just the maid, she had become a public figure, a symbol of hope for many. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the doubts that still crept into her heart. Would she always be seen as the girl who once worked in the shadows of others? Would the world ever accept her as the partner of a man who had everything? As much as she loved the groom, the pressure from the outside world was starting to wear on her. The groom, for his part, had always stood by her, a rock of unwavering support. But even he could feel the strain. Though the world had praised their love, the reality of being constantly in the spotlight had begun to take its toll on both of them. They had always faced adversity together, but now it felt different. The challenges were no longer just about their love, they were about their place in a society that wasn't ready for a love like theirs. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, the maid and the groom found themselves alone in their living room. The tension between them was palpable, neither of them sure how to address the growing distance they felt. The maid sat on the couch, her hands in her lap, staring down at her fingers. The groom, standing by the window, watched her silently. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. She looked up at him, her face softening. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle it all, the pressure, the judgment, the eyes of the world watching us. But some days, it feels like it's all too much." The groom walked over and sat beside her, his hand finding hers. "I know," he said softly. "It's hard. But we've always gotten through the hard times. We'll get through this too." She nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. "But what if we're not enough? What if the world never sees us the way we see each other?" The groom turned to her, his expression fierce with determination. "What matters is how we see each other," he said, his voice steady. "We're not here to prove anything to the world. We've already proven everything to each other." He paused, squeezing her hand. "We've fought for this love, and that's all that matters. No one can take that away from us." The maid looked at him, the pain in her heart easing slightly as she met his gaze. For a moment, the outside world faded away. It was just the two of them, the couple who had endured so much, now standing together, ready to face whatever came next. "I know," she whispered, the weight of his words sinking in. "I just need to remember that sometimes." The groom smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "And I'll remind you every day," he said. The days that followed were filled with small moments of reassurance. They spent more time together, just the two of them, away from the eyes of the world. They took walks in the park, had quiet dinners at home, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. With each passing day, they found new ways to ground themselves in their love, reminding each other of the strength they had built together. As they faced the world outside, they did so with the knowledge that they were not just a couple, they were a team. And no matter how hard things got, no matter how many obstacles they faced, they knew that as long as they had each other, nothing could tear them apart. The maid, once uncertain of her place in the world, now stood tall beside the man she loved. Together, they had rewritten their story, and together, they would continue to do so, facing each new challenge with the unwavering belief that their love was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. Inevitably, the couple's life continued to evolve, marked by new milestones and the ongoing challenge of navigating their unique relationship in the spotlight. The maid, once a symbol of humility and hard work, now stood proudly beside the groom, her partner in every sense. Their bond, forged in the crucible of societal scrutiny and personal struggles, had grown deeper with every passing day. But as they embraced this new chapter, they found that no victory came without its hurdles. The world was still watching, still waiting for them to falter, and despite the growing acceptance they had gained in certain circles, the whispers had not fully ceased. For every kind word they received, there was another skeptical glance, another person wondering how long it would last. As their fame spread, so did the expectations. The couple was no longer just a story of love defying odds, they had become a beacon for something larger, a representation of hope for those who had long felt invisible, for those who had been told they were not enough. It was a mantle they both wore with pride, but also with a sense of responsibility. There were days when the weight of that responsibility felt heavy, and the fear of losing it all crept into their hearts. The maid, in particular, struggled with the attention. She had never imagined a life where she would be recognized for something other than her work, where her voice would be heard and her story shared. Now, as she walked beside the groom through the corridors of their newly acquired home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still the girl who once had nothing. She had learned to embrace her newfound position, to stand tall, but there were days when doubt clouded her mind. She wondered if, deep down, she would always be defined by her past. The groom, always attuned to her emotions, could sense the unease that lingered beneath her surface. He had always been her biggest supporter, but now, he too struggled with the pressure that came with being the man beside her. He knew their love was strong, but the world's gaze, always searching for weakness, was something they had to contend with. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, the groom found her sitting by the window, looking out at the city below. The quiet of the night, the distant hum of the world moving around them, seemed to echo the tension they both felt. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, but knowing that the silence between them had grown too heavy. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked softly. She didn't turn to face him, but she nodded. I don't know if I can do this forever. The world watching us, judging us, it's not easy." The groom sat beside her, his hand finding hers. "I know," he said quietly. "But we've made it this far. We've fought for what we have. And no matter what happens, we don't have to face it alone." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't want to disappoint you. I don't want to be the reason this all falls apart." He smiled, the warmth in his eyes evident. "You could never disappoint me. I'm here, with you. Always. And as for the rest of the world, they don't get to decide what we have." The maid's heart swelled with emotion at his words. She had always feared that she wasn't enough, that one day the weight of her past would overshadow everything they had built. But with him by her side, she realized that nothing else mattered. Their love was built on something real, something they had created together, and that was all that mattered. The next day, they took a trip together, just the two of them, to a quiet retreat far from the eyes of the world. It was a moment for them to reconnect, to remember who they were when no one else was watching. They spent their days exploring nature, enjoying simple moments of peace. And in the stillness, the maid found a sense of clarity. She was no longer the girl defined by her past. She was the woman she had always been meant to be, and she was strong enough to face whatever came next. As they walked along a quiet trail one afternoon, the groom turned to her. "I know it's been hard," he said, "but you're not alone. And you never will be." She smiled, her heart light. "I know," she said. "And I'm ready. Ready to face whatever comes next. With you." Together, they returned from their retreat, more confident in their love, more certain in their future. They knew there would be more challenges ahead. Life was never without its struggles, but they also knew that they were stronger together. No matter what the world thought, no matter what doubts still lingered, they had proven time and time again that their love was real, and it was unbreakable. Inevitably, the days that followed the retreat were filled with renewed purpose. The maid and the groom had spent precious time away from the pressures of the world, reconnecting with each other and with themselves. The peace they had found in the quiet of nature was a reminder of what really mattered. But as they returned to the hustle and bustle of everyday life, the challenges they faced remained. Despite the comfort they found in their love, the world around them was not as forgiving. The whispers, though quieter now, were still there. Some said their love was a fairy tale, destined to fall apart once the novelty wore off. Others continued to question their every move, eager to see them stumble. But the couple had grown stronger. They had faced these doubts before, and with every trial, they became more certain of the bond they shared. The maid, who had once been filled with uncertainty, now stood with a quiet confidence. She had learned to ignore the noise, to trust in the love she and the groom had built. And he, standing by her side, had never wavered. He had seen her strength long before the world did, and now, more than ever, he knew that their love was unshakable. Yet, even with all the growth and strength, there came a moment that tested their resolve in ways they had never imagined. One afternoon, the groom received a phone call that would change everything. He stood at the window, looking out at the city below as he listened, his face growing more serious with every word. The maid, who had been sitting on the couch, noticed the change in his demeanor and stood up, her concern immediately rising. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. He hung up the phone, turning to face her. "It's my family," he said, his voice tight. "They want to meet with us." The maid's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the rumors, the stories of the groom's family, of their wealth, and their disapproval of their relationship. It was no secret that they had never fully accepted the maid, or their love. The groom had always kept his distance from them, but now, it seemed, they were insisting on a meeting. The maid felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. She had never felt fully comfortable around the groom's family. Their world was so different from hers, and she had always feared that they would see her as unworthy. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The groom sighed, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and resolve. "I'm not sure. But I think it's time we faced them. We can't keep avoiding them forever." The maid's stomach tightened. She had always known that one day, they would have to face the people who had never accepted her. But she had hoped that day would never come. The groom walked over to her, taking her hand in his. "Whatever happens, we will face this together," he said, his voice steady and firm. "You are not alone." His words, though comforting, did little to ease the knot of fear in her chest. She knew he was right. They couldn't avoid the inevitable, and they couldn't let the world define them anymore. They had already proven their love to each other, and now, they had to prove it to the people who had never believed in them. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with tension. The maid found herself rehearsing what she would say, preparing for the worst. She had always been told that she was not good enough, that she didn't belong in the world of the groom's family. But she knew that she couldn't let that define her anymore. She was no longer the same woman she had been when they first met. She had a voice now, and she wasn't afraid to use it. On the day of the meeting, the groom and the maid arrived at the family's estate, a mansion that seemed to loom over them, a symbol of everything they had fought against. The maid felt small as they approached the grand entrance, but she held her head high. They were here, together, and nothing could change that. Inside, the groom's family awaited them, their expressions cold and unreadable. The maid's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood tall, her hand firmly held in the groom's. The groom's mother, a tall, elegant woman, was the first to speak. We've asked you to come here today because we want to understand what's going on, she said, her voice sharp. Why this woman? Why her? The maid felt the weight of the question, but she didn't flinch. Because she's the person I love, the groom replied, his voice steady. And that's all that matters. The room fell silent, and for a moment, the maid feared that the tension would be unbearable. But then, the groom's father, a stern man who had never hidden his disapproval, spoke. You think you can just defy everything we've built? He asked, his voice low and menacing. You think this is the way to prove something? The maid opened her mouth, but the groom stopped her with a simple touch. This is not about proving anything, he said. This is about love. Our love. The room went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The maid looked at the groom, and in that moment, she knew they had done it. They had stood up to the people who had tried to tear them apart. They had faced the judgment and the doubts, and they had come through stronger than ever. They were ready to face whatever came next. Together. Inevitably, the meeting with the groom's family was not the final chapter of the challenges they would face. The maid and the groom had stood their ground, and although the meeting had not gone as they expected, it had marked a turning point in their journey. The groom's family, though still hesitant, could no longer deny the strength of their love. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. However, as the couple left the family estate, they both knew that this was only the beginning of something even more significant. The world would continue to watch, and as their lives unfolded, new challenges would arise. In the weeks that followed, the maid found herself reflecting more on the journey they had taken to get to this point. She had never imagined she would be sitting across from the groom's family, being questioned, scrutinized, and yet, standing tall with her heart full of conviction. She had always seen herself as an outsider, as someone unworthy of such a life. But with the groom by her side, she had come to realize that she had always been enough. She wasn't just the maid anymore, she was a woman who had carved out a place for herself in a world that had once told her she didn't belong. Their love, once a secret, was now out in the open. It had been tested, tried, and scrutinized, but it had only grown stronger. But despite their progress, the weight of public opinion still loomed large. The maid found herself questioning how long their love could truly withstand the pressure. Would the world's doubts continue to haunt them, or would they eventually be able to live their lives free of judgment? It was a question that lingered in her mind as the days passed. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, the groom turned to her, sensing her unease. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently, his voice soft but full of concern. She looked at him, her heart heavy with unspoken thoughts. "I'm just wondering," she began, "how long we can keep doing this. How long we can keep pushing back against the world's expectations." The groom smiled softly, his eyes full of understanding. "As long as we have each other, we'll keep fighting," he said firmly. "We've already proven that our love is real. No one can take that away from us." She smiled faintly, comforted by his words. But the doubt still lingered, nagging at her. They had fought for this love, but would it be enough to withstand the future? The next few weeks were filled with more public appearances, more media attention. The couple had grown accustomed to the scrutiny, but it was never easy. Every time they stepped into the spotlight, they felt the weight of the world watching them, judging them. The maid had learned to ignore it, to push through the discomfort, but there were days when the pressure seemed unbearable. On one such day, the maid found herself walking alone in the city, lost in thought. She had been to another public event, where the questions had been invasive, the scrutiny relentless. As she walked through the bustling streets, she couldn't help but feel like she was still the girl who didn't belong. She had fought so hard to get here, but was it really enough? Would they ever truly be accepted? As she walked past a small park, she saw a group of children playing. They were laughing, carefree, completely oblivious to the world around them. Something about their joy struck her deeply, reminding her of the simple things in life, the things that really mattered. She sat down on a nearby bench, her heart heavy with emotion she had been holding in for so long. She was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of proving herself. But as she sat there, watching the children run and play, something inside her clicked. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future she and the groom had built together. She was fighting for the life they deserved to live, free from the judgment of others. And with that realization, the weight on her chest lifted slightly. She stood up, her resolve solidifying. She would face the world, not as the maid or the outsider, but as the woman she had become. She would stand tall beside the man she loved, and together, they would face whatever came next. The groom, as always, was there for her when she returned. He could see the change in her, the quiet strength that had returned to her eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, his concern still evident. She smiled at him, the doubt she had carried now fading into the background. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Ready to keep fighting. Ready to face whatever comes next." The groom reached for her hand, his smile full of pride. "Then we'll face it together," he said, squeezing her hand gently. And together, they would face whatever the future held. They had already proven their love was unbreakable, and now, they would build a life that was truly their own, free from the expectations of others. They had come so far, and nothing could stop them now. Inevitably, the days following the maid's moment of clarity brought a shift in her perspective. She had spent so long under the weight of doubt, but now, standing beside the groom, she felt something different, a renewed strength, a quiet confidence that she had never thought possible. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship continued to grow stronger, despite the world's unrelenting gaze. Their love was no longer a secret whispered behind closed doors, it was something to be celebrated, even if not everyone understood it. The maid had become an inspiration to many. She had spoken at the conference, faced the judgment of the groom's family, and now, she was learning to embrace her place in a world that once told her she didn't belong. But just as they were beginning to settle into their new lives, an unexpected challenge arose. The groom's past, which had always been a shadow hanging over them, was about to come to the forefront. The maid had always known that there were things about the groom's life he hadn't shared with her, details of his rise to wealth, the secrets that had shaped him into the man he was today. But she had never pushed him to open up about it. They had built their relationship on trust and love, and she had always believed that his past didn't matter. However, one evening, the groom sat her down with a serious expression on his face, something that was rare for him. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice low. "Something about my past that I've never shared." The maid's heart skipped a beat. She had always known there was more to his story, but hearing him say it like this made it feel all too real. She looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The groom took a deep breath, then met her gaze. "Before I met you, before everything changed, I made some choices I'm not proud of. I did things that have come back to haunt me." The maid felt a knot tighten in her chest. She knew that his past wasn't perfect, but hearing him admit to it made her feel uncertain. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was involved with people who had a lot of power, a lot of influence. I was trying to climb the ladder, trying to prove that I could be more than just another face in the crowd. I got mixed up in some things I shouldn't have. And now, those people are back in my life." The groom's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of silence. The maid sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just said. "I never wanted you to know about them," he continued. "I didn't want you to see me as the man I used to be. I wanted to be the man who stood by you, the man who shared your dreams. But now, they're demanding things from me, things that could jeopardize everything we've built." The maid felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The groom, the man she loved, the man who had always been her rock, was now caught in a situation that could destroy everything. She felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her, but also a sense of fear. She had never imagined that their love could be threatened by something so dark, so deep in his past. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The groom looked away, his jaw clenched in frustration. "They want me to use my influence for their gain, to help them in ways I can't be a part of. I've tried to stay away from them, but they're not giving me a choice." The maid reached for his hand, her grip firm. "We'll face this together," she said, her voice full of conviction. "No matter what it takes, we'll face it together." The groom looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," he said. "I never wanted you to have to carry this burden." The maid shook her head, her heart swelling with love and determination. "This is our burden now, and we'll carry it together. Whatever happens, we will stand by each other." As they stood together in that quiet moment, the reality of the challenge they now faced began to sink in. The groom's past had come back to haunt them, and there was no escaping the consequences. But they were ready. They had already fought for their love, and they were prepared to fight for their future. No matter what the world threw at them, they knew that as long as they were together, they could face anything. And so, they set out on a new journey, one that would test their strength, their trust in each other, and their commitment to the life they had built. They had already overcome so much, and now, they would face the ultimate test. But whatever lay ahead, they knew they were stronger than they had ever been before. Inevitably, the weeks following the revelation of the groom's past were filled with tension and uncertainty. The couple had faced so many obstacles together, but now, they were up against something that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. The powerful figures from the groom's past had returned, and their demands grew more intense with each passing day. The groom, once a man of mystery, now found himself torn between the love he had for the maid and the dark ties that sought to pull him back into a life he had long left behind. The maid, for her part, stood by him, unwavering in her belief that together they could overcome anything. But the weight of the situation was heavy on both of them. The world around them had already been quick to judge, and now, with these new threats hanging over them, the maid couldn't help but wonder if their love was enough to withstand it all. She had always feared that the world would never truly accept them, that their pasts would haunt them forever, but now, with everything on the line, those fears were more real than ever. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of their living room, the groom turned to her, his face weary. "They won't stop," he said, his voice tight. "They're threatening to expose everything. They want to use me, and if I don't comply, they'll destroy everything we've built." The maid felt a cold shiver run through her at his words. She had never imagined that the consequences of the groom's past would come crashing down on them so harshly. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The groom sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't let them win. I can't let them take us down." The maid reached out, taking his hand in hers, a steadying force. "We've fought for our love before, and we'll fight for it again. No matter what they throw at us, we'll face it together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I don't deserve you," he said softly, the weight of the words heavy in the air. The maid shook her head, her heart swelling. "You've always been the man I love, and nothing changes that." Together, they decided to confront the people from the groom's past. It was a dangerous decision, one that could either solidify their future or tear them apart. But they had already come so far, and they weren't going to back down now. The day of the confrontation arrived, and the maid stood by the groom's side, her hand tightly clasped in his. The air was thick with tension as they entered the meeting room, where the powerful figures from his past waited. The groom's former associates, men and women who had once controlled his life, looked at the couple with cold, calculating eyes. The maid could feel the hostility in the room, but she refused to let it show. They had already proven that they could handle whatever came their way. This was no different. "I know why you're here," the groom said, his voice steady but firm. "But I won't let you use me again. I won't let you destroy what I've built." The leader of the group, a tall man with sharp eyes, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You think you can walk away from us?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We gave you everything. We made you who you are. And now you think you can just throw it all away?" The groom stood tall, his resolve unwavering. "I've made my choices," he said. "And my choices are with her." He nodded to the maid, who stood beside him, proud and unyielding. The powerful figures exchanged glances, their expressions darkening. The maid could feel the intensity in the room, the pressure building with each passing second. But she stood firm, her heart beating steadily in her chest. The groom's past was powerful, but their love was stronger. "You can't control us anymore," the maid said, her voice rising with conviction. "We are not afraid of you." For a moment, there was silence in the room. Then, the leader of the group stood up, his face tight with anger. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice cold. "But you won't get away with this. We'll make sure of it." The maid and the groom stood their ground, unshaken by the threats. "We've already faced worse," the groom said. "And we'll face whatever comes next. Together." With that, the meeting ended. The couple left the room, their hearts heavy but resolute. They knew that the battle wasn't over, that the people from the groom's past would continue to try to tear them apart. But they also knew that they had each other. And as long as they had that, nothing else mattered. They walked out of the building, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held. No matter the challenges, no matter the obstacles, they had proven time and time again that their love was unbreakable. And they would continue to prove it, every day, for the rest of their lives. Inevitably, as the weeks went by after the confrontation with the groom's past associates, the couple found themselves in a quieter, more peaceful space. The threats, though never completely gone, had been managed, at least for the time being. The couple's resolve had remained unshaken, and the world outside seemed to settle down. However, even in the calm, the underlying pressure of public opinion and their place in a world that often didn't understand them still lingered. They had won a battle, but they knew the war was far from over. The maid, who had once felt uncertain of her place in this new life, was now learning to embrace it fully. She had proven herself time and again, showing the world that she was not just the woman by the groom's side but a force to be reckoned with on her own. But the deeper challenge lay not in the outside world, it lay in the two of them learning to live in a space where they were not defined by their pasts or their obstacles but by the future they were building together. As they navigated this new chapter, there came a moment that reminded them of the importance of looking beyond the pressure and embracing the love that had carried them this far. One afternoon, the groom surprised the maid with an impromptu getaway to a small cabin in the woods, far away from the city and the constant buzz of their busy lives. It was a retreat, a place for them to reconnect, away from the judgment, the expectations, and the doubts. It was just the two of them, surrounded by nature's quiet beauty. As they sat together on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange, the groom turned to the maid, his eyes soft but filled with something deeper and unspoken gratitude. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low. "For everything." The maid smiled, the sincerity in his words touching her more than she had expected. "I never thought I would get here," she said softly, looking out at the horizon. "I always thought I'd be the person in the background, the one no one noticed. But now, I see that I can be more. I am more." The groom squeezed her hand, his expression full of pride. "You've always been more," he said. "I've always known that." They sat in silence for a while, just holding hands, letting the serenity of the moment settle in. The world beyond the cabin didn't matter at that moment. All that mattered was the connection they shared. It was a connection that had been tested by time, by public opinion, and by the weight of the past, but it was unbreakable. As the evening grew darker and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, they made a vow to each other. "No matter what happens," the groom said, "we will face it together. Always." The maid nodded, her heart full. "Together," she agreed. The next few days were a time of rest and reflection. The couple spent their time hiking, cooking meals together, and talking late into the night about everything and nothing. It was the first time in a long while that they were able to simply be. No cameras, no expectations, just the two of them enjoying each other's company in a way that felt completely natural. But even in this peaceful space, the maid couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was still something they hadn't fully addressed. The world would always have an opinion, and their relationship would always be under a microscope. The doubts, the whispers, would never fully stop. But she had learned something important in the quiet of the woods: they were stronger than the opinions of others. Their love had been tested, tried, and scrutinized, but it had endured. And as long as they were together, nothing could break them. When they returned to their life in the city, they did so with a renewed sense of purpose. They had already proven that their love was stronger than any external force, but now, they were ready to face whatever came next with a clearer vision of the future they wanted to build. It wasn't about pleasing anyone else, it was about living authentically, about creating a life that was true to them, no matter what the world thought. The couple had already faced their darkest days and had come out stronger. They knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but they were ready for it. The maid, once uncertain of her place, now stood by the groom's side with confidence, ready to face whatever the future held. And together, they would build a future of their own, free from judgment, free from the constraints of the past, and built on a foundation of love that nothing could shake. Inevitably, life after the retreat was still not free from the challenges they faced. The couple had come back to the city with a renewed sense of purpose, but with that came the reality that the world was still watching. The maid, once uncertain about her place in the groom's world, now stood firm beside him, having proven time and time again that their love was unbreakable. They had built something together that was theirs alone, a bond that could withstand any trial. Yet, even with their strength, the weight of outside judgment still lingered. The world was quick to assume that their love would eventually fail, that the differences between them, their pasts, their status, the whispers that followed them, would tear them apart. But the maid and the groom had learned to ignore the noise. They knew the truth of their connection. Their love was not based on the opinions of others, but on the deep trust and respect they had for one another. They had both worked so hard to get to this place, and they were not about to let anyone take it away. Still, even though they had grown stronger together, there were moments when doubts would creep in. The pressure of their lives in the public eye was constant. Every time they stepped into the spotlight, they were scrutinized. Every word they said, every move they made was observed, analyzed, and judged. But as they had done time and time again, the couple faced these challenges together. One evening, as they sat in the living room of their apartment, the maid turned to the groom, her eyes reflecting a mix of determination and uncertainty. "Do you ever think about what the future holds?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of vulnerability. The groom looked at her, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Every day," he said. "But what matters is that we're facing it together. We've already proven that we can make it through anything." She nodded, but a flicker of doubt remained in her eyes. "I know," she said, "but sometimes, I wonder if we'll ever truly be able to live without the world judging us." The groom took her hand, his touch grounding her. "We'll never stop facing judgment, but we've already proven that we don't need anyone's approval. We have each other, and that's what matters." The maid looked at him, her heart swelling with love. She had heard those words before, but in that moment, they felt like a lifeline. She had always feared being judged, feared that her past would define her. But with him by her side, she had learned to trust in herself, to trust in their love, and to trust that together they could face whatever came their way. The days that followed were filled with more public appearances, more scrutiny, but they no longer felt the sting of judgment as they once had. The maid stood with the groom at his side, her head held high. She no longer felt like the outsider, the one who didn't belong. She had proven to herself, to him, and to the world that she was worthy, not because of her past, but because of the person she had become. They had both faced so many obstacles, and yet they had come out stronger. But even in the quiet moments, when they were alone, the weight of their love and everything it represented was not lost on them. They knew that it had been a long road to get here, but they also knew that the journey was far from over. There were still more challenges ahead. The world would continue to judge them, but they had already shown that they were unbreakable. They would face whatever came next with the same strength, the same love, and the same unwavering belief in each other. And so, they moved forward, not with the fear of what the world might think, but with the confidence of knowing that their love was enough. It always had been. It always would be. Together, they would continue to build a life, a future, a love that was theirs and theirs alone. Inevitably, life continued to move forward for the maid and the groom, though the path was never without its twists and turns. They had weathered so many storms together, overcoming the judgments of others, facing the weight of the groom's past, and battling the expectations that the world had placed upon them. But through it all, their love had not only endured, it had grown stronger. The couple had learned, over time, that the world would always have something to say. No matter how many hurdles they jumped, there would always be critics waiting for them to fail. But with every challenge they faced, they had only become more resolute in their commitment to one another. The days were quieter now, with fewer public appearances, and the couple found solace in the peace of their everyday life. They spent more time at home, in the comfort of their shared space, away from the scrutiny of the outside world. The maid, once filled with doubt, now stood confidently by the groom's side, no longer afraid of what others thought. She had learned to trust herself, to trust in the strength of their bond, and to trust that no matter what the world believed, their love was real, and that was all that mattered. However, even in this quieter phase of their journey, there were still moments when the weight of their love and everything it represented felt overwhelming. It wasn't just about surviving the public's judgment, it was about continuing to build a life that was theirs, a future that no one could take away. One day, as they sat together in the warmth of their home, the groom turned to the maid with a thoughtful look on his face. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "We've come so far, but there's still so much more to do." The maid, sensing the depth of his words, turned to him. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The groom sighed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We've fought so much to get to where we are. But there are still people out there who don't believe in us. People who think our love is just a phase, that it's not strong enough to last." The maid looked at him, her heart swelling with understanding. She had always known that their journey wouldn't be easy, but hearing him speak so openly about the lingering doubts from the outside world made her realize just how much they had both endured. "I know," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "But we've already proven that we are enough. We've faced everything together, and we're still here." The groom reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We've proven that. But sometimes, I wonder if we're doing enough to show the world that our love is real." The maid smiled, squeezing his hand. "We don't need to show the world anything. Our love doesn't need validation from anyone else." The groom nodded, his expression softening. "You're right. We've already built something beautiful, something no one can take from us." The couple spent the next few days reflecting on their journey, looking back at how far they had come and how much they had learned along the way. They had faced obstacles they never thought they would overcome, and yet, here they were, standing stronger than ever. It wasn't just about surviving the challenges, it was about thriving despite them. The maid had come to realize that her worth wasn't defined by the judgment of others, and the groom had learned that his past didn't have to define his future. Together, they had created something beautiful, something that no one could tear apart. The groom, ever the protector, had been concerned about the future, about how they would continue to face the world's scrutiny. But the maid had a newfound confidence, and she knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. She no longer feared the opinions of others. Their love was enough. As they looked ahead, they knew that there would always be challenges. The world would continue to judge, to doubt, and to question. But they had already overcome so much, and nothing, not even the harshest judgments, could break them. They had learned that the most important thing was not what the world thought of them, but how they saw each other. They had already proven to themselves that their love was real, and now, they were ready to face whatever came next. Together. Inevitably, after all the struggles and triumphs, the maid and the groom found themselves at a place where they could finally breathe without the constant pressure of the world watching them. The challenges they had faced together had only served to strengthen their bond, and now, as they stood side by side, they knew they had proven to the world, and to each other, that their love was real and unshakable. Their journey had not been an easy one, but it had been worth every moment. They had faced judgment, scrutiny, and the shadows of their pasts, but they had overcome it all. They had built a life that was truly theirs, not defined by the opinions of others, but by the love and respect they shared. The maid, once unsure of her place in the world, now stood confidently beside the groom. She had proven herself, not just to the world, but to herself. She had learned that her worth was not defined by her past or by the judgment of others, but by the strength of her heart and the love she had for the groom. And the groom, once a man of mystery, had revealed his true self, not just to her, but to the world. He had shown his vulnerability, his strength, and his unwavering love for the maid, and in doing so, he had built something that was far more meaningful than wealth or status. Together, they had created a future that was theirs to shape, a future filled with love, understanding, and mutual respect. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, but they had proven time and again that they could face anything as long as they were together. The maid smiled as she looked at the groom, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it hand in hand, just as they always had. they had fought for their love, and they had won. And in that moment, they knew that no one could ever take that away from them. The groom, sensing her thoughts, took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with pride. "But we're just getting started." She nodded, her heart full. "Together, we can do anything," she said, her voice steady with conviction. The groom smiled, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Together, we can do anything." As they stood there, in the quiet of their home, the world outside no longer seemed as intimidating. The whispers, the judgments, the doubts, they had all faded into the background. What mattered now was the love they shared, the life they had built, and the future they would continue to create. Together, they had proven that no matter how impossible things seemed, they could face it all. And as they moved forward, they knew that their love was the one thing that no one could ever take from them. It was unbreakable, unwavering, and it would continue to grow, stronger with each passing day. They had faced the impossible, and they had come out on top, not because of the world's approval, but because of their belief in each other. And with that, they knew that their journey, though it had been difficult, had only just begun.